we're now joined by Juanita van Heerden, who's a director at Escape, which is a safe house for survivors of human trafficking. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
All right, perhaps let's start with a definition, because I don't think a lot of us understand what human trafficking is. When we hear that, you almost think about people being sold off as slaves and that kind of thing. Typically, what is human trafficking, and what kind of human trafficking are we seeing in South Africa?
So, unfortunately, the movies portray a picture that isn't really true in terms of trafficking victims oftentimes being kidnapped, where in South Africa, for the most part, 90% of our victims have been trafficked from within South Africa. And unfortunately, so a lot like what you just saw in the clip now in terms of what happened in Durban. They'll get promised a job in the big city. Oftentimes it's systematic racism and oppression, oftentimes where people are considered vulnerable and would then be liable to fall for the promises made. So they would come to the big city, as you saw, like they would purchase the tickets, and when they arrive, their bodies would go through a whole bunch of abuse and trauma. Oftentimes they would be forced to go onto drugs, and by the time you see a woman standing on the street selling herself, quote unquote, that by that time she is basically dead to herself, numb on the inside, and the pain and the trauma that she's experienced is really, really intense. So for the most part, the type of trafficking that we've seen has been sex trafficking for the most part. That's the most common one in South Africa.
So a girl would arrive at this location. How does it escalate? Is she put onto drugs to make her dependent? I guess already their freedom is taken away, phones, ability to communicate. But how do they then move to the actual sex trafficking itself?
So what would happen is, it would happen in a variety of ways, but it could also happen online. So we're aware of 5 different very prominent adult websites in South Africa where it is sold as escorts, but then oftentimes the traffickers use those platforms to facilitate the buying and the selling of women and children against their will, and those women don't get any of the money. And other times, like in this case, for instance, in Durban, where they arrived at the house, what would oftentimes happen is many men would come into the room over and over and rape them. Oftentimes they would wear police uniforms, so the survivors or the victims would feel that they've got nowhere to go or nobody to trust, and really like abused, beaten, malnourished, and treated really horribly. And also you'll find that in order to be able to endure this kind of abuse, one would need to be on some sort of a substance, because it's basically it's unnatural and really not normal, and basically impossible to endure this kind of lifestyle without being on some sort of substance.
Do families sometimes get involved in the selling of family members?
Yes, that's often also the case. And unfortunately, a lot of times the survivors would have already been exploited from a young age. So there would already be a disconnect between their body and what they feel that their worth is, and so they would unfortunately be vulnerable to be trafficked again. And this obviously makes reintegration very difficult, as reunification with family a lot of the time is not possible. So we would basically need to assist them in starting over a whole new life, which is a very, very complex journey.
All right, we're going to talk a little bit more about that just now, but I just want to get a sense of the size of the problem. Again, when we talk about trafficking, one often thinks about crossing borders. One rarely thinks that this could be a major problem internally.
Yeah. Well, like I said, 90% of our survivors have been trafficked from within South Africa. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's so easy to remain hidden, because it's not like a Thai girl or a woman from Russia that you see on the street. And so that I think that's one of the reasons how it remains hidden. And unfortunately, corruption is also plays a huge part into that, because the police oftentimes sweep things under the mat and are on the payroll of the traffickers. We've seen, and there is overwhelming evidence in terms of research done over the past 20 years in terms of corruption with police officials and just different departments within the government, unfortunately, which really helps the whole syndicate to be able to flourish.
These girls, once they're now being trafficked sexually, the people that buy the sex, do they know that these girls are trafficked, or they just think this is a normal brothel and it's just a service they're paying for?
So I think anyone with a little bit of emotional intelligence will be able to read between the lines.
Yeah.
So oftentimes the survivors have said that they knew that the men knew, but they choose not to go there. Other times the women are really scripted on what to say that, I'm struggling at home, I'm doing this for my children, I'm actually like studying, so I'm doing all of this for extra money. And so they're really scripted into what to say.
Yeah, and I suppose fear keeps them compliant because the consequences would be too grave. So
definitely.
A few manage to get out and come to someone like you. What's the first steps of trying to help them and the long road to rehabilitation?
That's a good question. So the basics is shelter, food, medical and legal assistance. Obviously, all of their documentation has been taken away. There might be court cases. Physically, like I've said, they've been malnourished, they've been through a lot of issues. They might have new chronic diseases. And so that's a situation that needs to be dealt with. A very big part of what we do is the therapeutic services in terms of psychosocial support, just due to the nature of trauma and all the different personality disorders that they might develop because of trauma, such as borderline personality disorder, different levels of psychosis, schizophrenia, paranoia, depression, anxiety, insomnia, etc. And so that is the biggest part of what we do. And then we also offer life skills, which we try to tailor per individual. As like, for instance, we've had a survivor who can't read or write English, and so her skills would look different from somebody who might be able to do a computer course, etc. And so then ultimately we try to help them to reintegrate back into society and also provide aftercare services.
I mean, the psychological aspect of this must be the biggest mountain, really, because to go back into society, which is normal, inverted commas, and they've been out of it for so long, that must be quite a challenge, and also how they see themselves compared to other people.
It honestly is one of the biggest challenges, and we try to make as many resources available as we can, but ultimately the trauma leaves such a deep ingrained pain in their psyche, and it's a huge journey. And unfortunately we often struggle with getting the right psychiatric services, just because of the fact that the Department of Health is so overwhelmed by the need in this country, and to go private for psychiatric services is very, very expensive in order to get the right diagnosis so that we can assist the survivor best. So that really is one of our biggest challenges. And as you say, and also when they get reintegrated or reunified with family, wherever that is safe, oftentimes the family or the loved ones don't know how to help, and they don't know how to handle the panic attacks and the nightmares and all the psychiatric challenges that they have. So something that I've learned in the 8 years of being at Escape is that trauma is lifelong.
And I would imagine there's stigma and shame associated because of the violations that have happened repeatedly over time. It's sometimes difficult, I guess, for people who don't understand to look at this person and say it wasn't your fault, or that you weren't a participant in this.
Yes, unfortunately, oftentimes, I also used to think when, before I knew what what was really happening. When you see a woman on the street, you think that that's what she chooses. But oftentimes, when you speak to her, they'll always want a different life if they have an option. And so one of the things we're very concerned about, even at the moment, is the prostitution law reform, where the country is looking at possibly legalizing prostitution and the buying and the selling of sex. And something that we've noticed that cannot be denied is the fact that we found that the process of selling sex is a system that is designed to facilitate and to gender-based violence and the exploitation of women and children. And so we would want to focus more on those purchasing sex and prosecuting them, and rather making resources available to women who would want to have an alternative life that would take away the vulnerability that got them into that situation in the first place.
Do you think that the sentences given to traffickers is stern enough, severe enough to discourage? Because I would think this is probably one of the things that we can do straight away, is to have very severe consequences for anybody involved throughout the chain.
I love the questions that you're asking, and it's so necessary to ask these questions. Unfortunately, we have had a large number of residents, survivors at our safe house, and there has not been one successful prosecution of any of the traffickers for the entire time that I've been there, which has been 8 years. And so that is greatly discouraging, because, and that just again shows the corruption in terms of all the different departments within government and how things get swept under the rug. Oftentimes, the National Prosecuting Authority has been quoted on saying that they prefer not to take on trafficking cases because they're too complex. And also, obviously, traffickers have loads of money, the money that the women have paid for with their blood, sweat, and tears. And so they pay off very easily. And another thing, unfortunately, oftentimes when our residents, we've encouraged them to pursue cases, to show up for court, and we try our best to prep them and to be there for them as support. And oftentimes, in fact, every single time when a trafficker has been, this is only in the Western Cape, I just want to say a disclaimer, I know that other provinces are a little bit better, but every single time they would let the trafficker go out on bail. And so you would have charges of rape, drugs, prostitution, kidnapping, murder, abuse, a whole array of stuff, illegal weapons, and they would get away with like 10K bail, which is anyway not even their own money, which is a shame. And then obviously the guy won't rock up for his appointment for the following court date. So unfortunately, the justice system continues to fail survivors and victims in this country. And one of the other parts of overwhelming evidence is the US TIP report, which happens annually. And the government is oftentimes called out for not following through on prosecutions and not doing a really good job in terms of rescues and prosecution.
Juanita, I wish we could talk for longer. Perhaps this is a conversation that we need to have more often, just to keep it in mind's eye, and also to make people a bit more aware and sensitive about things that are happening around them. But thanks so much for joining us tonight, and please keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thank you.